A common narrative that I hear these days is something along the lines of drum samples make drums sound fake, or drum samples are the curse of modern technology and only used by lazy engineers. However, having worked on massive records with some of the world's best engineers, mixers, and producers, I can tell you that that is not the case. Samples themselves are not bad. It's only when you use them poorly. Now, samples are also not new. They've been around longer than DAWs themselves. However, they were just harder to do practically. What is new is how easy they are to slap on a track and make them sound bad. What is up, guys? Alex from ANAK here, and I'm going to talk about my approach to using drum samples, making them sound good in your productions, sample augmentation versus sample replacement, why I prefer layering in audio tracks versus using real-time triggering plugins, and how I use multiple samples on any given drum to actually enhance your production and your arrangement overall. So first off, what is the difference between sample augmentation and sample replacement? This is one of the first big myths that I see a lot of the time, is people use those words interchangeably and seem to be conditioned to think that sample replacement is the only way to go. And I think part of that is to do with the default in most of the triggering plugins is to have the mix knob all the way to 100%, so it's purely replacing the original track with the samples. The thing most people don't think about is the fact that there is a mix knob, and you can actually use that to mix it in alongside the original sound. And that is when we get to sample augmentation, when you're using samples alongside the original sound to augment it, to add, to improve the original sound. Basically, kind of using it as parallel processing to the original drum track. This allows for the nuance of the playing in the original track to actually come through, but be enhanced and augmented by samples. Now, people have to remember that when you are replacing a close mic in a kit, you're still going to hear the playing and the original sound in the overheads and the room and the bleed of other mics. So you can't completely get rid of it unless you are using purely samples and replacing the shells and the cymbals and everything, which at that point is just programming the drums, which is a whole different video in itself. But in terms of live drums, the samples themselves don't replace the drummer, and they don't really excuse bad playing. They are just helping the overall tone of the drums and how it fits into the mix as a whole. Now, I do sample augmentation on 99% of the things that I do, but I will say that I do replace kick drums a lot faster than anything else. Now, a very important thing is don't just use samples for the sake of using samples. Actually have a purpose for each of the samples that you put in your mix. Make sure that they fit within the context of the song and the sound that you're going for the drum kit. When it does start to sound bad is when people just use the kind of default sound or some metal tone when it's not really in the right context for the song they're producing. Now, each sample has to have a purpose within the tone of the drum, and you can use multiple, which I'll talk about in a second. But you have to think about what these samples are adding in the tone overall, not the soloed drum sound, but the actual overall tone in the mix in context with everything else in the track. Personally, I have a few samples that I literally load up into every single mix just because I know how to use them and what tone they will bring to the drums. I use them as a tool, just like I would use my favorite EQ or compressor. These samples are just tools to add to that sound. Then I add and try different ones to really craft the specific sound for that track. When you're choosing your samples, actually think about what it brings to the sound and how it's going to work in conjunction with other samples if you're using multiple. Each sample doesn't actually have to sound good on its own, but if it works in conjunction with the original or other samples, it can sound absolutely amazing. So don't get fooled by the soloing mentality. Remember to think about it in context. Now, the other thing to think about is how the samples are going to sound within the context of the parts being played. You need to be especially careful when you're adding samples to a very dynamic part. For example, one-shot samples may not work very well if you have a lot of rolls or subtlety in the playing, but they would work really well in the context of a really raw, straightforward rock chorus groove. Now, a misconception is that one-shots mean no dynamics, but that's not the case. The volume changes, it's just they're not very good at doing subtleties. Now, while finding samples that might work for a more dynamic part, some sample packs do include different velocities and multiple samples for each velocity to allow it to sample in a more realistic fashion. Now, like I said, one thing you can do is actually use multiple samples in conjunction with each other. Even within triggering or drum programming softwares, you you can load up multiple and mix them together. Now, for instance, I typically use between 2 and 5 samples on any given drum in a mix. You have to think, what am I going for in the sound of this mix? And then how does each sample that I find add to that overall goal? I think of samples as more like tools, like EQ and compression. Instead of EQing crack into a snare, I use a sample. Instead of adding a whole bunch of bottom end, I use a sample. Now, that being said, I don't not use EQ and compression. I definitely still do, but I just think of samples like tools in that same way. Now, something that I find a lot of people don't think about when it comes to samples is they can actually be used to enhance the arrangement of your song. Especially when you use multiple samples, you can bring layers of samples in and out depending on the part in the song. Do you need a bigger chorus? Add a thicker, bigger snare sample. If you need a smaller, more intimate verse, take out most of the samples and just have a really dry, dead sample. On big records, we sometimes do different takes for different sections with different kicks or snares subbed in, or different miking techniques, or even in a different room or a different studio altogether. This can help with the arrangement of the song, with the drums really subtly changing and fitting in for different parts of the song. So with using multiple samples or mixing different samples in for different parts, we can achieve the same kind of effect. And of course, you can just have fun with it. I have layered in door slams on snare drums just because, well, it sounded kind of cool. Now, as I hinted at before, I do like having samples as individual audio tracks, as opposed to running real-time triggering softwares like Slate Trigger or Drumagog. What I do is actually have each individual sample as its own audio track within the session. Now, there are a few reasons why I like doing this. First, I just find it easier to manipulate with the plugins and the faders that I'm used to, not in the context of some sampling plugins interface. Second, they're just top of mind. I see my options laid out in front of me instead of having to go into menus in a plugin. Third, it's easier to do arrangement changes with multiple samples in different sections. I just can see them laid out really simply in front of me. And fourth, the most important to me is that the samples are just always right. There's never any mistriggers or glitches, and I can make sure that each sample is sample accurately in phase with every other sample and everything else in the drum track. Plus, it's just less processing power because sample plugins seem to be very DSP hungry. Now, how do I do this to make sure that each of these samples sounds good and natural? Well, one thing I definitely don't do is just copy and paste a sample on the grid along with the real drum and just hope for the best. I've seen that done, and yeah, typically that sounds like trash. Now, I do use triggering programs, and they're very handy to find new samples. However, I then print them as audio and go through each hit to make sure that it's actually aligned with the drum that it's supposed to be aligned with. But I mostly use tools like Massey DRT or Avid Sound Replacer. And when I use these tools, I use the dynamics feature in it so that it accurately represents the dynamics in the triggers that I'm feeding it. Now, these tools do work well for me because I've amassed a good library of samples that I can use with them. However, there's nothing wrong with using sampling plugins as long as you end up printing it and going through each hit to just double check. Now, another thing that I do is I actually lay in more samples than I think I'm actually going to use, because in the moment of creativity, I don't want to have to go find samples that I think might work to lay in. I just want to have it right there ready to go and grab it and turn it up. So I try and add samples in preemptively thinking about what I'm going for with this track. So to summarize, samples can sound really good. Use them as tools to enhance your overall mix and your arrangement of your song. Think about what each sample is bringing to the table. What is it adding to the sound? Don't just use samples for the sake of using samples. And just remember, use as many samples as you see fit for the desired outcome. And through all this, try and lean towards sample augmentation, not sample replacement. But that is it for this video, guys. Thanks so much for watching. Give this video a thumbs up if you found it helpful. And if you're interested in more things about my production style and my drum production, check out the playlist on screen. Subscribe if you haven't already. I will see you in the next one. Until then, always be creating.